I watched them drag Sarah into Devil's Canyon like she was nothing more than a sack of grain. 5 men on horseback, faces covered, moving fast through the red dust while her screams echoed off the canyon walls until they faded into nothing. I was watering my horse at Miller's Creek when I heard the gunshots from the Hendricks ranch. By the time I got there, smoke was rising from their cabin and old Jim Hendricks was face down in the dirt with 3 bullets in his back. Sarah was gone. The hoofprints told the whole story. They'd taken her alive. My hands were shaking as I loaded my rifle. Sarah Hendricks wasn't just any woman. She was the only person in this godforsaken territory who'd ever looked at me like I was worth something more than the bounty on my head. 3 months ago, when I rode into Copper Ridge with a bullet in my shoulder and no money for a doctor, she'd cleaned my wound and fed me soup without asking a single question about the blood on my clothes. The sun was already setting, painting the canyon entrance black as a tomb. Any sensible man would wait for daylight, maybe gather a posse from town. But I knew these men. I'd seen their work before. Bodies left mutilated in shallow graves. Women found days later if they were lucky enough to be found at all. Sarah didn't have days. She probably didn't have hours. I thought about the way she'd smiled at me last Sunday after church, how her hand had lingered on mine when she passed me the hymnal. For the first time in my life, I'd started thinking about settling down. Maybe buying some land and learning to live without looking over my shoulder every minute. Now her screams were burned into my memory, and all those dreams felt like they belonged to some other fool. The canyon stretched ahead like the mouth of hell itself. Somewhere in that maze of rock and shadow, 5 killers had the only woman who'd ever made me want to be a better man. They probably figured no one would be stupid enough to follow them into Devil's Canyon at night. The place was a death trap even in daylight. Narrow passages, loose rock, and a dozen ways to get lost forever. I checked my guns one more time and nudged my horse toward the canyon entrance. The animal could sense the danger and fought against the reins, but I pushed him forward anyway. As we crossed into the shadows, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Sarah's voice, faint but unmistakable, calling my name from somewhere deep in the darkness. But what I didn't know yet was that following that voice would lead me straight into a trap that had been 20 years in the making. The hoofprints in the soft canyon dirt told a story I didn't want to believe. 8 horses, not 5. More men had been waiting inside the canyon, which meant this wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. This was planned. I followed the trail deeper into the maze of red rock walls that towered above me like the ribs of some giant beast. My horse's hooves echoed with each step, the sound bouncing off the canyon walls and coming back to us like whispers from the dead. Every shadow could hide a rifle barrel. Every rock formation could conceal an ambush. The trail split into 3 different paths about a mile in. I dismounted and studied the ground by moonlight, trying to read the signs. The main group had gone left, toward the heart of the canyon where the old Apache caves were hidden. But 2 riders had broken off and taken the right path, and one of those horses was carrying extra weight. My gut told me they'd split up on purpose, send the main group one way as a decoy, while a smaller team took Sarah somewhere else. These weren't random drifters looking for easy money. They knew this canyon, knew how to move through it, knew exactly how to disappear. I thought about Marcus Cole and his gang, the ones who'd been terrorizing settlements from here to Silver Falls. Cole was smart enough to plan something like this, and mean enough to take a woman just to watch a man suffer trying to save her. We had history, him and I. 5 years ago, I'd been the one to put his brother in the ground after a bank job went sideways. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of wood smoke from somewhere ahead. They'd made camp, confident enough to light a fire. That told me they weren't worried about being followed, which meant they either had more men than I'd counted, or they'd chosen their spot carefully. I tied my horse to a dead juniper and continued on foot, rifle in hand. The smoke was coming from the left trail, the obvious choice, but my instincts were screaming that it was too easy, too clean. Cole was the type to leave a trail of breadcrumbs leading right into a killing ground. 20 yards further, I found what I was looking for. A piece of torn blue fabric caught on a mesquite branch. Sarah had been wearing a blue dress at church last Sunday. But this fabric was on the right trail, not the left where the smoke was coming from. I crouched behind a boulder and tried to think like Cole. He'd expect me to follow the main trail, walk right into whatever trap he'd set up around that campfire. But he'd also know I might be smart enough to spot the decoy, which meant the right trail could be a trap too. The smart play was to circle around, try to get above them and see what I was dealing with. But time was working against me. Every minute I spent being careful was another minute Sarah was in their hands. I heard a woman's scream echo from the right trail, sharp and desperate, then cut off abruptly. But something about that scream didn't sit right with me. It sounded almost rehearsed, like someone trying too hard to sound terrified. That scream was wrong. Too perfect. Too timed. Sarah screamed like a wildcat when she was truly scared. I'd heard it once when a rattler got into her chicken coop. This sounded like someone who'd been told exactly when and how to scream. I took the middle path instead, the one with no tracks at all. If Cole was playing games, he wouldn't expect me to ignore both obvious choices. The narrow passage forced me to move single file along a ledge barely wide enough for a man's boots. One wrong step, and I'd fall 60 feet to the rocks below. Halfway along the ledge, I found something that made my stomach turn. A child's rag doll, weather-beaten and torn, wedged into a crack in the rock. Below it, scratched into the stone with something sharp, were initials. M.W., age 7. This wasn't the first time Cole had used this canyon. The doll was old, maybe months old, and those initials had been carved with the desperate precision of someone trying to leave a final message. A little girl named M.W. had been here before Sarah, and from the look of things, she'd never made it out. My hands clenched around my rifle as the pieces started falling together. This wasn't about robbery or revenge. This was about something much worse. Cole wasn't just taking women. He was collecting them. And Devil's Canyon was his hunting ground. I pushed forward along the ledge until it opened into a small clearing hidden between towering rock walls. What I saw there nearly made me lose my footing. 3 wooden crosses driven into the ground, each marking a shallow grave. Fresh dirt on one of them, maybe a week old at most. Carved into each cross was a woman's name and age. Martha Walsh, 19. Rebecca Stone, 23. And the fresh grave, Maria Santos, 16. Cole wasn't just a killer. He was a collector, and he'd been using this place as his private cemetery for God knows how long. Sarah wasn't his first victim, and unless I stopped him tonight, she wouldn't be his last. I heard voices drifting up from below, men talking in low, confident tones. Following the sound, I crept to the edge of the clearing and looked down into a hidden valley I hadn't known existed. 3 campfires burned below, and I could count at least a dozen men moving around between them. This wasn't just Cole's gang. This was an army. But what chilled me to the bone was what I saw in the center of their camp. A wooden cage, big enough to hold a person, with iron bars that gleamed in the firelight. And next to it, another cage that wasn't empty. A woman sat inside, her long dark hair covering her face. But when she looked up at the sound of approaching footsteps, I saw something that made my world tilt sideways. It wasn't Sarah in that cage. It was Maria Santos, the girl who was supposed to be buried under that fresh cross. She was alive, which meant Cole wasn't just killing these women. He was keeping some of them. Maria Santos was supposed to be dead. I'd been at her funeral in Silver Falls just last week, watched her mother throw dirt on what I thought was her daughter's grave. But there she was, very much alive, sitting in that cage like she'd been there for months, which meant Cole had been playing a much longer game than anyone realized. He wasn't just taking women, he was making them disappear from the world completely, fake their deaths, let their families bury empty coffins, then keep them hidden in this canyon hell where no one would ever think to look. I counted the men again, 15, maybe 16, all armed and spread around the camp in positions that showed military thinking. Cole had been a cavalry officer before he turned outlaw, and it showed in how he'd organized this operation. Sentries posted at every approach, weapons cached in strategic locations, escape routes planned and marked. But I still didn't see Sarah anywhere, which meant she was either in one of the tents or they'd taken her somewhere else entirely. The thought of leaving Maria in that cage made my skin crawl, but charging down there would just get all 3 of us killed. I worked my way around the rim of the valley, looking for a better angle, when I heard footsteps on the rocks behind me. I spun around with my rifle raised, but it was too late. 3 men had me surrounded, guns drawn and pointed at my chest. "Marcus said you'd come," the biggest one said with a gold-toothed grin. "Said you were too stupid and too sweet on that Hendricks girl to stay away." They marched me down into the camp at gunpoint, and I got my first close look at Marcus Cole in 5 years. He'd aged hard. His hair was streaked with gray and his face carried new scars. But his eyes still held that same cold intelligence that had made him dangerous even when he wore a uniform. "Well, well," he said, rising from beside one of the fires. The famous bounty hunter, walking right into my parlor. "Tell me, friend, how does it feel to be the hunted for once?" I kept my mouth shut and my eyes moving, cataloging weapons and positions. Maria Santos was watching from her cage, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror. Up close, I could see she'd been here for weeks, maybe longer. Her dress was torn and dirty, her face gaunt from poor food and little sleep. "You're probably wondering about our little collection," Cole said, following my gaze. "See, I learned something important during my army days. Fear is a powerful weapon, but hope is even better. Keep them alive, keep them hoping for rescue, and they'll do anything you ask." He walked over to Maria's cage and ran his fingers along the bars. "Little Maria here has been very cooperative, haven't you, sweetheart? Tell our friend what happens to girls who don't cooperate." Maria's voice came out as barely a whisper. "They get buried alive." Cole nodded approvingly. "Smart girl. Now, about Miss Hendricks. She's proving a bit more spirited than our usual guests. But I think she'll calm down once she sees what happened to the last man who tried to rescue one of my girls." He signaled to two of his men, who dragged a body out from behind one of the tents. Even in the firelight, I could recognize the star pinned to the corpse's vest. Sheriff Tom Bradley from Copper Ridge, the man who'd been leading the search for Maria Santos. But what made my blood run cold wasn't the sight of Bradley's body. It was what Cole pulled out of his coat pocket next. A letter with my name written on it in familiar handwriting. Sarah had written me a letter, and somehow, Cole had gotten hold of it before I did. Cole opened Sarah's letter with the slow, deliberate movements of a man savoring his victory. The paper crackled in the firelight as he unfolded it, his eyes scanning the words I'd never gotten to read. "Listen to this," he said to his men, loud enough for Maria to hear from her cage. "My dearest James, I know we haven't spoken of it directly, but I believe God has brought us together for a purpose. If you're reading this, then you've already made your choice. You've decided I'm worth the risk." My stomach clenched. Sarah had been planning to give herself to me, heart and soul, and somehow Cole had intercepted that moment before it could happen. But how had he gotten the letter? Sarah was supposed to deliver it yesterday evening. "She's quite the romantic, your Sarah," Cole continued, his voice dripping with mock sentimentality. "She goes on for 2 pages about building a life together, about the children you might have, about growing old on some little farm away from all the violence." He looked up at me with those cold eyes. Touching, really. Almost makes a man want to believe in happy endings. He folded the letter and tucked it back into his coat. Of course she wrote this 3 days ago, before she knew what her daddy really was. The words hit me like a physical blow. "What are you talking about?" Cole's grin widened. "Oh, you don't know, do you? About Jim Hendricks and his little arrangement with me? About how he's been feeding me information on which ranches to hit, which families had money worth taking." I thought about the scene at the Hendricks place. Old Jim face down in the dirt with 3 bullets in his back. But now that I replayed it in my mind, something felt wrong about the positioning of the body, about the lack of defensive wounds on his hands. "Jim Hendricks was my inside man for 2 years, Cole said. "Fed me everything I needed to know about every family within 50 miles. In exchange, I left his ranch alone and split the take with him 50-50. Maria spoke up from her cage, her voice stronger now. "He's lying. Sarah found out about her father 3 days ago. That's why she's really here." Cole backhanded Maria through the bars, the sound sharp as a gunshot. "Shut your mouth, girl." But the damage was done. The pieces were falling into place now, and the picture they formed made me sick. Sarah hadn't been kidnapped. She'd come here voluntarily, probably trying to make some kind of deal to save the families her father had betrayed. "Where is she?" I demanded. Cole pointed toward a larger tent at the far end of the camp. "She's been trying to negotiate for the lives of everyone her daddy helped me rob. Quite the little martyr, offering herself in exchange for amnesty I was never planning to give." But what he said next made my blood freeze in my veins. "The funny thing is, she actually thinks you're coming to save her. She doesn't know that you're already too late." The tent flap opened and Sarah stepped out. But she wasn't the woman I remembered. Her blue dress was clean, her hair was brushed and pinned up properly, and she walked with the confident stride of someone who belonged here. When she saw me tied up by the fire, she didn't look surprised or afraid. She looked disappointed. "You shouldn't have come." "James," she said, her voice carrying none of the warmth I remembered. This was supposed to be simple, clean. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. This was the woman who'd bandaged my wounds and fed me soup when I was bleeding and broken. The woman who'd smiled at me in church and made me believe I could be something more than a killer for hire. Sarah, what the hell is going on? She sat down on a wooden crate across from me, smoothing her skirts like we were having tea instead of sitting in an outlaw camp surrounded by murderers and kidnappers. My father was weak, James. He took their money, but he also kept records. Thought he could use them as insurance if Marcus ever turned on him. Stupid man didn't realize that keeping evidence of your crimes isn't protection. It's a death sentence. Cole moved to stand behind her, his hand resting possessively on her shoulder. Sarah came to me with a proposition. Clean up her father's mess, eliminate the witnesses who could connect him to our operations, and in return, she'd help us expand into new territory. I stared at the woman I'd thought I loved, trying to find some trace of the person I'd believed her to be. The letter. You wrote that letter knowing I'd never get it. I wrote it to make sure you'd come alone, she said simply. Marcus needed you dead, and I needed it to look like you died trying to be a hero. Better for everyone if people remember you as the man who died trying to save an innocent woman instead of the killer you really are. Maria Santos spoke up from her cage, her voice cutting through the night air like a blade. Tell him about the others. Sarah. Tell him about Rebecca and Martha. Sarah's composure cracked for just a moment. Shut up. She picked them out, Maria continued, ignoring Sarah's glare. Rode into town, made friends with the lonely girls, the ones with no family to miss them too much. Then she'd tell Marcus where to find them. The full horror of it crashed over me like a cold wave. Sarah hadn't just betrayed me, she'd been Cole's scout, identifying victims for his collection. Every woman in those graves, every girl who disappeared without a trace, Sarah had marked them for death. You're a monster, I whispered. Sarah stood up and walked over to me, crouching down so we were eye to eye. I'm a survivor, James. My father was going to get us all killed with his weakness and his guilt. I did what I had to do to stay alive. She reached out and touched my cheek with fingers that felt like ice. I did care for you in my way. That's why I'm going to make this quick. But as she spoke, I noticed something she'd missed. Maria had been working at the lock on her cage with something sharp, maybe a piece of metal from the cross I'd seen earlier. The lock was old and rusty, and she was almost through. Sarah pulled a small derringer from her dress pocket and pressed it against my temple. Any last words for the man you thought you loved? I looked her straight in the eyes and said the only thing that mattered now. Maria, now. Maria burst out of her cage like a wildcat, 20 feet of fury and desperation crashing into Sarah before anyone could react. The derringer went off, the bullet whining past my ear and sparking off the rocks behind me. Both women hit the ground hard, rolling and clawing at each other in the dirt. Cole's men scrambled for their weapons, but they hesitated, afraid to shoot with Sarah in the middle of the fight. That hesitation cost them everything. I rolled behind the nearest rock as Maria and Sarah's struggle carried them toward the fire, and Maria did something that changed the entire game. She grabbed a burning branch from the fire and swung it in a wide arc, scattering embers across the dry brush that surrounded the camp. Within seconds, flames were racing up the canyon walls, cutting off the outlaws' escape routes and turning their hideout into a death trap. In the chaos, I managed to work my hands free from the ropes that bound them. Cole was shouting orders at his men, trying to organize a bucket line to fight the fire, but it was too late. The flames were spreading faster than they could contain them, and the smoke was already making it hard to breathe. Sarah broke free from Maria's grip and dove for the derringer, but I was faster. My boot came down on her wrist with enough force to break bone, and she screamed as the gun skittered away into the darkness. When she looked up at me, her mask was finally gone completely. No more pretense of love or innocence, just raw hatred and the desperate fury of a cornered animal. You have no idea what you've done, she snarled. This was bigger than just Cole's operation. There are people in every town from here to California who were part of this. Rich people, powerful people. They'll hunt you down for destroying their supply chain. Maria appeared beside me, Cole's rifle in her hands. She's lying about being forced into this. I heard her planning the whole thing with Cole. She enjoyed picking out the girls who would suffer the most. The fire was spreading too fast now. Half of Cole's men were already fleeing up the canyon walls, abandoning their leader and their prisoner. Cole himself stood near the edge of the camp, his face a mask of rage and calculation as he watched his empire burn. This isn't over, he shouted over the roar of the flames. I know who you are, bounty hunter. I know where you go when you think you're safe. He turned and disappeared into the smoke. leaving Sarah behind to face the consequences of her choices. Sarah tried to run, but Maria was ready for her. The rifle shot echoed off the canyon walls, and Sarah Hendricks dropped to the ground, finally paying the price for all the innocent lives she'd helped destroy. As we climbed out of that burning hell, Maria and I both understood we'd survived something that would haunt us forever. But we'd also ended a nightmare that had been destroying lives across the territory for years. The woman I'd thought I loved was dead, but somehow, riding away from Devil's Canyon with Maria Santos beside me, I felt more free than I had in years.